I try not to shoot unnecessarily, but sometimes sorry, I listened to that siren and I totally lost my thought because I wasn't sure if we should hold for it or not. Sorry, what was the question again? Is it
Thank you for joining us again for another episode of The Work, our ongoing film series about filmmakers and film in Chicago. My name is Curtis Matzke. I'm a writer-director, and I'm here with
Jim Vendiola. I am also a writer-director, mainly anyway.
So today we're going to talk about kind of strategy and film strategies, which is a pretty broad kind of topic of conversation that could apply to many things that people think about in regard to film, whether it's creative strategies and like doing the kind of, strategies and kind of getting the outcome that you want, creatively in the film. You can also talk about it from a business financial perspective and like how you get money and what that strategy is, but also how you craft a career strategically and kind of always continue being part of the conversation and, sustain your life as a filmmaker. But so Jim, I wanted to start off and talk to you broadly and ask, what kind of strategies have you employed as a filmmaker in the process of making a film initially?
I think, I think each project should dictate kind of a certain strategy itself. Obviously, I think, a lot of filmmakers would disagree, but to be like rigid and not fluid and think you're going to like do the same thing every single time, regardless of like the content or type of project, maybe a little naive or at least, expecting too much before you actually get into the nitty gritty of something. So I think that's a long way of saying that, like, I just sort of evaluate an intended strategy on a project by project basis. I think a good rule of thumb, speaking at a high level, is if you, like many of us, a lot of our projects, have little to no money behind them. So I think a good strategy is just to kind of, what am I trying to say? Approach making a film with that in mind. I think the losing battle is to approach a film with no money by thinking you're going to shoot it like a Hollywood film or make it look like a Hollywood film. And so as a result, I, have had to come up with creative ways of shooting things on, little to no budgets. And oftentimes that's like handheld, very little lights, natural light, bounce boards, improvised scenes, that kind of stuff, sort of like guerrilla style.
Totally. So. Yeah, I've had this conversation with people before, how like it has to be like scalable, right? Like you don't want to like it's funny talking about like the process of like development and pre-production. There's certain things that you like always go through, but you do at the end of the day have to adapt to the type of thing that you're making, and that often depends on like, the money aspect of it. Like do you have money to do a formal like casting session or whatever, or are you just going to be able to do these other things that just make it work? But you kind of touched on that already as far as like strategies that you like disagree with, I guess. Like are there any like kind of specific things in like development or pre-production that other people like do that you like really try to avoid because it just hasn't worked for you in the past, or convert stuff that does work that you have to do each time?
I think a thing that, it's almost kind of a joke among like indie filmmakers at this point, but I think people still do it, is they think that the film is in the gear,
Hmm.
you know, where everybody wants to shoot on a red or an RE or in 4K or 6K, but you know, if you aren't developing your like photographic eye, you're just gonna have like shitty looking stuff in 6K or boring frames or like, you know, boring things going on. So I think, you know, a lot of my personal strategy is like just to constantly think about like the most interesting or unusual or daring way to do something regardless of like my available gear, you know. Most of my stuff is shot on like consumer grade equipment. So, you know, the last film I did was you know, shot on the Blackmagic pocket camera. So, you know, and I, you know, that is to say people are usually curious at festivals and Q&As and stuff about like what I shot on.
Yeah.
And so I think there are ways to make it look cool regardless of whether or not, you know, you're, like I said, shooting something in 6K with like a heavy duty camera.
Yeah, I shot my last film on 6K, which was a terrible decision for my hard drive.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Or your, you know, your RAM.
as someone who kind of like works in camera stuff, like for freelance work, uh, like having a little bit more of a visual background, it is sometimes hard to collaborate in that regard. Because I don't know, but like, do you like? You're very visual. Your films are very visual. I assume that you are very methodical about like storyboarding and shot list and stuff like that, right?
I've done it. I've done it both ways. I like, you know, uh, like I said, I think depending on the film and like what you have access to, like a run and gun kind of DIY guerrilla style could be good. And, you know, like if storyboards, you know, like if you're trying to shoot on the L or shoot in a museum, you know, which I did both for one film, you kind of just, you know, I think you trust that you'll, you know, capture what you aim to capture. But yeah, in terms of like framing and stuff, you really gotta go with the flow, right?
Yeah.
Especially in public and stuff like that. But yeah, when I work with a DP, you know, and have had to discuss storyboards and that kind of stuff, I still like the flexibility of, you know, sort of catching serendipitous moments and stuff like that. So I think I've done it both ways. I feel like at this point, I don't prefer one way or the other. I think like at the feature level, it would just kind of be smart to at least have like very, if not storyboards, like very specific ideas about what you aim to capture, you
Right.
know, like visually.
Yeah,
So,
I agree with that. I think that like it's funny sometimes I think a lot of indie DPs don't expect like like as much work from, you know, the directors with some of that stuff. I think like sometimes the DP is like expecting to have to come up with a shot list and do this kind of stuff, which is I typically defined as the director's role to like map stuff out and then
right.
collaborate with the DP as far as expanding that, scaling that down or up. To what is appropriate to the story. But you're definitely right. It like depends on the thing and like the aesthetics of, you know, doing a handheld, you know, run and gun setup with no lights versus like it might just. I'm always like in favor of those indie films that, you know they're an indie movie, right, and don't like pretend to be like a Hollywood, you know,
Totally.
thing.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of once you wrap your head around that, I think it opens you up so much more, and you can actually be more creative with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I sort of liken it to, the way writing works and how you know the sort of language and the vocabulary you use should follow, you know, kind of the the sort of style you're trying to write in, you
Yeah,
know. And so I feel like if, you know, you're trying to do something that's like very indie, you know, but you've got like crane shots or dolly shots, you know, it just sort of a lot of your viewership won't pick up on that stuff. But I think for a lot of us, it does sort of take you out of the movie where you're like, why are you trying to do that?
Yeah.
These two people are just talking. Why do we need a dolly shot when you clearly have no money? I'm more interested in like you selling the reality of these two
Right.
characters to me, you know?
I mean, it's another artifice that's added to it, right? And I think that like also like as audiences, I think a lot of people are like conditioned to see like I don't know if they're like even conscious of it, but like they're conditioned to see things like those kind of like crane or dolly moves or highly produced setups, but with like you know high class talent and writing and all these other things. So like if it's an indie movie that doesn't have Brad Pitt or George Clooney, that is like overproduced, like there's a weird disconnect in your brain, right? Where you're like,
Yeah.
why isn't this as good as it seems like it should be, like it is visually? Um,
Yeah. I think it just like sort of, you know, people need to all get on the same page and figure out kind of what movie they're making.
yeah,
And I think that, when you find people that all understand one another, that is, great synergy, because you end up sort of making something that everybody kind of knows what the thing is, rather than all these disparate ideas of like, oh, the cinematographer, for some reason thinks you need to see all four corners of a room, when in fact, like you said, like if the performance is good, if the content is interesting, like who cares if the room is well lit, you know?
it's one of those things where like I always think that limitations can actually help you, yeah, get out of like make you creatively problem solve and get out of these situations in a more interesting way than you could have imagined. And you definitely, like you said, you want to have that same thing. It's like working with actors. You want to have a little bit of like in the moment kind of tactility to it in a way. And not to say that you can't still achieve that with a bigger budget and more resources. Obviously, you can. But it's different, scalable. So like, so along those same lines, like, what are your kind of strategies, other strategies that you might have in production, like working with actors? Like, are you the kind of director who like does rehearsals, or like, or even before that in casting, or do you like having a casting session and auditions with people, or do you just do something else?
Yeah. I think, if we're talking about stuff that's strictly mine, I tend to gravitate towards people I find just sort of interesting in real life, or that kind of have some sort of edge or overlap that is reminiscent of that character, whether or not that person is a trained or professional actor. So which is to say that I do, I have a history of working with non-professional performers. I think that elicits like interesting things. I think they have like what Buddhists refer to as like the beginner's mind, where they don't have like these preconceived notions about, you know, what to expect or how to do something. And, I think that sort of, you get unconventional results out of that. And that's to say I wouldn't probably attempt that for high drama or things that demand very, very specific styles of performance, or, um, very specific effects,
Mm-hmm.
like dramatic effects.
Yeah, like you need to hit a certain point in the narrative that might not be possible with a non-actor.
Yeah. So I guess I've historically written around those moments that I know would be sort of too much for a non-traditional performer. Um, which is to say that I don't value the craft of acting. I just, I think that, you know, something can be as overacted, like unintentionally, as it can be underacted by a poor performer.
Yeah, I think
So
yeah, it's again kind of like the same overproduced, you know, thing. There's something about finding the truth in just like these moments with and like looks that people aren't, you know, thinking about in the moment. But like I mean, there's that one rule. It reminds me of the rule about, you know, never work with kids or animals, right?
right.
But that it's one of those things where like I've seen some like great like performances from kids who have never acted and stuff before, and I've never really worked with kids myself or with non, you know, actors. I mostly do end up working with more professional actors. Um, but I've always want to try and kind of find those people who I'm just drawn to. It can definitely lead to a lot more kind of more interesting results. But do you like just find these people? Like, are they people in your circles that you like know already, or from like?
Yeah. Historically, they've been people I've known about, and maybe not friends, but people that I've come across that sort of fit the part, or people that uh, yeah, I guess fitting the part can mean different things. It could be like an aspect of their already existing personality that reminds me of the character, or for like library hours, that part was written with that performer Cam Damage in mind, because I knew that the process of like shibari rope bondage would be something that, well,
What's the
I,
most?
for one, couldn't teach, but that also someone couldn't really pick up uh from like a YouTube tutorial or something. So
Yeah, there might be one out there.
yeah, but I also understood that that particular performer, they would be up for a certain type of content.
Do you rehearse with your actors, and like how often do you talk with your actors? I know that's like a weird, broad thing to say, but like,
Yeah.
I feel like isn't it the Coen brothers who have said like they don't like talking to actors, or someone like that, which surprised me because, you know, they're very methodical and precise about, you know, the way they storyboard things. But then I
Right.
swear I heard like Joel Coen or someone say that, you know, we just don't talk to the actors that much. They just do their.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the low or no budget route, typically means that you won't have a lot of rehearsal time, but I like to be in touch with the people I'm going to shoot something with, as much as it feels necessary. Like if I'm going to do an improvised film, I sort of like to get on the phone with them and like talk about what maybe this character likes or doesn't like, and what their hopes and dreams and inner life is. But I also want to kind of get their take on how they see the character, just as much as I sort of want to impose my ideas. And so I think that feels the most rewarding for everybody, especially having a non-traditional actor be able to like contribute and feel like they had some input into what they're seeing on screen. um and so yeah, in terms of like an improvisational thing, maybe like a lot of back and forth discussion before we shoot, and then just kind of like see what happens on set for something.
Like blocking rehearsal kind of thing. I mean, that's more what I do. It's more like just kind of stand here, stand there, and then, you know, let them kind of figure out the in betweens a little bit.
Right, yeah, and just sort of come to a point, through the takes, to see what comes through, because there might be adjustments all around, right? You're like, that's not working. This person, whether or not they are a professional actor, is maybe like not really giving me what I need. Let's try it a certain way. So yeah, I think there needs to be room for that, once you're shooting.
Definitely. And it's one of those things that's tricky too ahead of time. Like you don't want to like spell out this whole emotional like map for the character because you want them to like live it in the moment and
Right.
figure it out. One thing that I like it just kind of like happened to start doing was not like an intended thought thing, but like I do a lot of my actual like directing via email. I'll just like
Hmm.
email people
Yeah.
at the time and be like, and I think it's one of those things where it is different than talking to someone directly. If you like write out a paragraph and it's like reading a novel versus seeing the movie adaptation of the novel. Like in a novel, like you're picturing all these things and filling in the gaps. And I think it actually like the response I've got, from actors and doing that is actually really like, useful and I think works in a weird way. So it's like that same kind of providing just enough information for them to work off of and then,
Right.
letting it go.
Well, yeah, it's nice. It's nice too. It's almost, better than a rehearsal, because if you over rehearse, then you get like these really mechanical performances. But if you sort of deliver the message in a way like an email, like you suggested, they have time to process that and sleep on it, and then it like seeps into their life, like they're thinking about it, like they're making their coffee or in the shower or brushing their teeth, and then there is more of an opportunity, speaking as a director and someone who doesn't understand acting firsthand, like as an actor, I would assume that sort of there are seeds that are planted there that are allowed to sort of manifest a little more, that are just a little less surface than a rehearsal where you're kind of mechanically going through things. So
Yeah, especially when like, I mean, they have to do all this other stuff too, as far as like if it's like a dialogue piece, they have to learn a bunch of lines, and you want all this other stuff to be just like
right.
feel second nature. When you're on set and working with actors, this obviously depends on so many different factors of what the scene is and what the interactions between characters is. But like, how many takes do you normally do for like, say, a typical dialogue scene?
um it's probably not a helpful answer, but I think as many as it takes is probably the most accurate, especially again, like working with little to no money. You kind of just need to, it's almost like throwing spaghetti at a wall, and you just got to keep doing it until something sticks. And so yeah, I mean, I think as many as it takes is like the most accurate. I try not to overshoot,
Yeah.
or worry that much about coverage, especially if sort of referring back to our sort of shooting strategy discussion. If you're shooting something handheld, maybe you don't need a ton of coverage.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I tend to make things that again don't rely that heavily on traditional filmmaking technique. So like if we're talking about like a Fincher-esque or a Hitchcockian type of like suspenseful build up, I don't typically do that stuff. So I guess my idea of you know shooting takes as if we're done when I get something I like.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about coverage because like yeah, just speaking about what you just said about Hitchcock and stuff, like the last one that I did, didn't have any dialogue, and it was like suspenseful horror. So, but I had a ton of coverage, like that. Like I was more interested,
sure.
like in getting all these kind of options, like because there's no dialogue, it's all just like pure visual language, mapped out. But it is very different than like doing like a dialogue scene. Yeah, because I would rather have more takes in a dialogue scene for performance and stuff like that. But in something like this, it's usually like a couple takes and we were like done and
Right.
the next thing.
Which is like, yeah, I mean, it's kind of what I was trying to articulate in the form follows function part of the chat, where, you obviously, the suspense and the buildup for orchestra is the film, essentially. So shot as many takes as you needed, and those just happen to be fewer because, like you said, it's not a dialogue driven piece. And, even in more dialogue driven films that I've done, it doesn't, my stuff again doesn't hang a lot on, dramatic performances.
Right.
So, so I think, it's easy to get people to kind of say what they need to say, and if the performance isn't like on point, or very precise, that sort of matters less to what I typically do.
Yeah, I mean, because like when Fincher does it, like he's doing it most of the time, it seems like intentionally just to like tire the actor out to get to that don't give a fuck moment, and they just like give it the most natural kind of result, right?
Right, or he's also like, so obsessed with craft that he wants the performer to do the exact same thing, like almost as if they're like a machine, in sync with the camera movement. Like, there's like a supercut where you could watch all these things he's doing, where like, I forget what movie, I think it's Zodiac, where a dude is like leaning back right as like the camera like sort of dollies in the exact same way that someone leans back in their chair. And it's like,
that is one of the things where I almost wonder when people talk about the takes, is it more of the actor just missed their mark by, a couple millimeters, and then, like he's that precise about, the sharpness of the image or some kind of technical thing where, it has to like line up perfectly, or it doesn't.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like, I feel like I'm the opposite in those terms. I think we're all the opposite of Fincher in terms of like available financing and resources and those kinds of things. But also, I mean, that stuff doesn't matter to what I'm doing, because like, well, historically it doesn't, because I've always, I don't know if you do this as well because you're also an editor, but as someone who did a lot more editing for other people earlier in my life, I do constantly think about the edit when I'm on set and directing. So I feel like that's, also informs like the number of takes I shoot, because if I feel like it'll cut together fine in my head, we could just sort of move forward from there.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I mean, I love, coverage for those kind of like if someone is just like walking into a room, like it can be one of those things where you can get coverage from so many different angles, because I am thinking as an editor, as far as like, again, if it's building tension in the moment, or like it does give you so many options to play with. But it's tricky. It's sometimes tricky figuring out, like in the moment, like, I mean, everyone loves a good like one or long take, right? But like you have to be committed, and sometimes it can actually take, much more time than doing more coverage. And like when you do more coverage, you have to move lights, you have to do all this other stuff. But with a oneer, you usually do have to rehearse it more, and you have to get it. This can apply to acting, but apply to camera or writing. Definitely probably applies to writing at some point. Recognizing when something's not working, which I've always said is like the hardest thing in filmmaking, realize, because everyone wants to, at a certain point, like think that they're like, their writing is brilliant or like their film is brilliant, but like sometimes you do have to step back and be like, like, why isn't this like resonating? Or why isn't, I mean, again, the hardest part for me is like when it's on set and you're under a time crunch and you have like people waiting and all this stuff, and it's a lot of stress, it's a lot of pressure. But then whether it's the staging, the acting, whatever, just not working, and then taking that, stepping back and taking that beat to realize how to rework it. Do you have any like strategies that you use as far as like getting past that point, or like acknowledging that?
Yeah, I think, part of it, outside of your crew and your collaborators, like, as I guess speaking as a writer director, so, to say that it's like your own content that, you know, you've created, and that you're, shooting the thing that you wrote. I think, like, kind of understanding what, the end goal of the narrative is, and knowing what you can rework on the fly is important. Um, that probably sounds really obvious, but at the same time, I think the more you kind of understand the underlying, like, the underlying things that will go into the successful delivery of your message or your theme, it kind of, yeah, I think it informs how you like rework something on the fly, because, yeah, I mean, we're all sort of, at least at the indie level, you know just sort of working with what we've got. And, oftentimes that means like losing a location or losing a resource that otherwise like changes the trajectory of how you can tell that story. And, even if that's like an experienced performer not being able to like deliver what, you know, you want out of them, like, it's kind of up to you to figure out the best way to make that work, I guess. Sometimes it's like shooting it and then cutting it, shooting it with the knowledge that you're not sharing with anybody else, that you're like not going to use it, or taking your DP aside or your producer aside and being like, what else can we do? Like, this
Yeah,
is,
that's what I was gonna say. I always try and have like a really strong creative producer who I can just bounce off ideas with, and like just like check in with. Just like, I'm not crazy, right? This is okay. Like, we're all okay. And again, sometimes it's hard when you're dealing with a producer, and it's like if they're concerned about time and things like that, which is their job. And then same thing with the DP. But yeah, it's definitely a lot to balance all at once, and you kind of just have to plow through. But I think you're right as far as like keeping to the integrity of the story and the project, and the intent of like what you're going to do with it is kind of like the ultimate thing, right? um but
yeah, if anything, to me, that's even more important than doing a rehearsal, is to make sure you're kind of like constantly in conversation with your creative producer or your DP, to make sure you kind of know what you're trying to achieve day to day. Because, I think those two people, more than anyone else on the set, will help you sort of figure out how to fix those things.
you have a great lookbook for this film. Are there things like that keep the project going? And like, so like, when I'll wrap production on a film, a couple of times I've actually made a trailer or something before I've finished. If it's like a longer thing in particular, I've like made a trailer or a sample to remind myself that I like the movie, or like to get excited.
Yeah, no, totally. And I don't know if you're like me in that, like, I kind of change my mind on what I like most or what I want to emphasize in any given project, like, over the course of making the project. So I think cutting a little like trailer for yourself, or setting something to music that you'll never be able to license, just to see, like, if it sort of strikes that intended chord you want,
Like a sizzle,
Um,
like you have to. Yeah.
yeah, sizzle reel, or kind of mocking up posters.
Yeah.
Whether or not that's like using images you don't have the license to, just for your own like private thing. I think those are kind of ways to sort of stay in love with your project.
I think you can do it even in the development early stages too, when you make like a lookbook and stuff, which is obviously helpful in communicating with, you know, like the DP and stuff like too, but like and actual like pre-production development stuff. I mean, it's nice when you can do these things that work kind of in tandem that keep the process alive when it feels like sometimes it will just never end and you're just like sitting on a script that's waiting for money and waiting for actors and all this other crap.
Totally, yeah. I don't think there's any one way to do that. Like I started putting together the first draft of the lookbook even before we had finished the screenplay. And as a result, I had people that are like, okay, cool, I'm interested, because I knew what I wanted the movie to be, and I was able to communicate that through a lookbook. And then, we had to finish the script to get it to people, but I was able to sort of like generate early interest and get a development grant just based on the lookbook, you know, which is good, because sometimes like people don't want a whole script. Like if you have like the first 10 or 15 pages of something, that's your sample right there. So,
Yeah,
and I'm not advocating for deceiving people that might see this and be like, oh really, you did that, like you lied to me. So there's not like
yeah. It's like,
quite the deception component so much as like knowing that there's no order to things, and you could generate interest for something that you actually like, that isn't like 100% finished.
I mean, I always like laugh when I admit I'm sure I'm not the only one who does this. Like whenever like the Sundance writing grant stuff comes along, and it's like for the screenwriting lab, and you're like, I think it's Sundance that only requires the first 5 pages of your feature script, and then if you advance, then you have to submit the rest. Of course,
Right.
when I submit, I don't have the rest of the script written, but I'm gonna submit the first 5 and see whatever happens. Like I'll have like I'm usually when those deadlines roll around, I'm halfway through the script, but I'm still gonna.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that like given the topic, that is sort of you know the apex of thinking strategically as an independent filmmaker, is like knowing when to kind of like fake it till you make it,
Yeah, I mean,
and when that doesn't work.
yeah, that makes sense. And like, I think that's the one thing that I always like try and talk to people on too. And I'm trying to be more conscious of. It's just like having actionable goals. Obviously, like again, these are all obvious things, but like sometimes we just need to like remind ourselves that like you know again. So this speaks to the kind of greater career strategy thing that I want to talk to you about briefly. And this will be our kind of last big kind of section probably in terms of strategy. Of course, we could spend all day talking about this crap. But what are your kind of like main strategies in as far as like building a sustainable career as a filmmaker, and like constantly you kind of constantly have to force yourself into the conversation even when you're
Yeah.
working on a film that is in development and pre-production for like a year. Like you still have to be press people to be like, I'm still out here working on stuff, because that
Right.
does translate to when you talk to financiers and when you find cast, all these other people that want to be like, oh, I want to work with that guy. So like, do you have any more general career strategy advice or tips that you implement?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think when I was younger, I think like a lot of us, were taught that self promotion is kind of obnoxious and not cool. And, to a large degree, I still agree with that. But I also feel like, in the business we're in, you either are doing that or no one knows who the fuck you are, unless you have a really amazing film that's gonna like promote itself, you know, that just like catches fire and you're like, oh, I don't know what to do with this. I guess like I'm along for the ride. So yeah, that said, I think you know, I've had to actively get very comfortable slash gradually more strategic about like being a self promoter, because you know, even if it annoys your viewership and like people on your social media, like whether or not they're aware of it, you're still like sort of like staying in their head, you
Exactly.
know? Like I don't feel good about like, you know, telling people to like watch my film after, you know, at every single festival it's at for like upwards of 18 months, you know, or 24 months. Like I know there's fatigue, but like at the same time, I mean, you're continuing to do that basically guarantees that like someone else is going to see it, and you know, not who hadn't, you know, been privy to it before, who, you know, that's again, you know, that person is a potential contact for, you know, a future project, you know, knows someone who knows a money person, you know. So it's kind of like playing the long game at the risk of like tiring out other people who, you know.
Right. And I think that it's so tricky because I think like yeah, it's kind of a necessary evil is basically what it is. And you kind of have
Yeah.
to, push your brand out there as a filmmaker, as a, artist or whatever. But also I do think that people are getting a little bit better at smelling out bullshit. So like if you don't actually have the work to back it up, like I feel like the worst thing that I could do is be like really great at self promotion and then have a really shitty film. And then,
Sure.
because then, like, I feel like if I were to make a great contact out of my promotion and be like, sell the thing really good, but then
Yeah.
the chops to back it up, then that almost kind of like burns a bridge in a weird way.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Like I had kind of not thought about that component until you said it, because I, you know, I said it sort of with you know, the, you know, being fortunate enough to have like, you know, 5 people that think my work is cool, that appreciates the way I do things. But yeah, I think you need to make stuff that is not only satisfying and fulfilling and true to your creative aims, but also, yeah, you kind of have to find your people.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, yeah, I think you have to get comfortable with not being everybody's cup of tea. And if you're like no one's cup of tea, maybe that requires some soul searching and figuring out like maybe what you could be doing better in
Absolutely.
your films.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, and that's like sort of more of the like the long game thing I was talking about, where you know sometimes your audience and your fan base informs like how you evolve, like you know, and it's kind of like a sort of um, macro equivalent to what we were talking about on set, where you know you could learn just as much from your crew as they can from you. It's the same thing that, you know, I think it extends to your audience and your relationship with your audience on a grander level, where if, you know, they respond specifically to one thing and maybe not so much the other, you know, like you could dig your heels in and be like, oh, well, I am the artiste and you are all, you know,
I'm brilliant.
morons. Or you could maybe like, you know, listen.
Yeah. Try.
So they don't know everything, you know, like Twitter can, you know, ruin you emotionally if you listen too closely to what someone has to say about your work, but you know, you could also make it a productive thing.
Yeah, you have to be self-aware, and I think that's like it's one of those things where filmmaking and then also all this marketing promotion stuff, they're all like muscles that you have to like flex, right? Like you have to work at. Like sometimes like this is partly why we're doing like these conversations where we talk about in an open way the process. Like sometimes you hear public conversations about film that are like strictly on the business side. They're like this list of things that you have to check off, and then you're like, boom, you're a successful filmmaker.
Yeah.
The conversation, but it's all these things kind of like working in tandem, right? It's like working the creative side, the business side, where you just have to like, you know, work on all of it equally. You can't just figure out a formula, and you have to ultimately find out what is appropriate for you and what strategy works best for you.
Absolutely, yeah. Which is, I think, why this series is cool, because you kind of get different takes, straight from the source of all of us who have, some degree of struggle versus like a Brett Ratner who literally like meets Spielberg in an elevator, right? And then so he doesn't really have to like define his aesthetic per se so much as, have the money dictate, what he's able to sort of like direct into. And so, yeah, I think I completely agree that like it's all about sort of like being a better rounded creator and knowing, what you're comfortable and what you're happy creating for yourself, and for your team, but also like how you are going to find the right audience for it, and there's a lot of trial and error in all of it.
I don't know how you are on set directing, but like a lot of people have this image of the director on set as being like, guy who knows the answer to everything, like who has to have like a kind of, like know literally every aspect of like whenever someone comes to you with a question. And it's like a very weird kind of leader-y role, right?
Yeah.
I sometimes get self-conscious because like sometimes I'll like admit that like I'm like if someone asks me something I'll be like I don't know, and I think that a lot of sets could benefit from normalizing that kind of like mentality to a degree. Obviously, like
Right.
we're talking about time, all these other things, pressures. You have to have answers to stuff. Obviously, you have to keep going. But sometimes I'll say I don't know, and it's because I know that the answer is going to reveal itself later.
Right.
It's going to be in the moment onset. And I think it's hard to articulate to people sometimes, how that works. Are you at all like that, or like how do you?
Yeah. I feel like
You also don't want you don't want people to lose confidence in you, obviously.
right there, it's the optics certainly play into it, and you don't want to compromise or settle, but I also think people at any level on a set appreciate being in conversation.
Mm,
Obviously you don't like want to set a precedent where the grip can weigh in on like
that's true.
how a performance is not working, but I mean, to a reasonable degree, asking a performer or hair and makeup how something looks, or your producer, um, or the AD, I think. Yeah, I mean, I think it's like a collaborative process in general, and people defer to you, but you don't have to like maintain integrity by basically being our president who just like
Yeah,
says things just to say things to like project leadership.
exactly. I think that at the end of the day, people need to trust the director to make these decisions, right? And I think that like I always like to hear everyone's, as many people as I can who I trust,
Right.
to give me, their opinion, and then in turn ask them to trust me to make the decision, even if they disagree with it. That's the thing that I think makes a healthy set and a collaborative, successful set.
Yeah, or if you're having like a performer with an insecure moment, you can just kind of make this deal with them, because it is a something you could fix in the edit, where you're like, okay, well, you do it your way if it feels weird, and then like give it to me my way a couple
Totally.
different times. And then, yeah, I think there is a level of, it's not quite deception, but it is sort of like, you're there to affirm everybody that they're doing a good job. And, like, that doesn't mean you deceive them when they're, doing poorly, but yeah, if you're going to tell them it's fine because it gets you to the next thing, then yeah, why not? They're not going to remember that.
How many projects do you normally work on at a time? Do you normally stick with one and just see it through? Because I'm one of those guys who has like ADD, so I'm like always wanting to try to do a couple different things. But
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, some people, I think a lot of us don't feel good when we don't have anything going on. I think that's just sort of like the creative brain. It's kind of like depressing if you don't have like one outlet. But, for me, I don't, I have a day job, so I don't, sustain myself on the film stuff. But in order to not feel completely worthless, I do like to have at least one thing, but it is kind of like this, then it's sort of this work-life balance, because, my weekdays are spoken for, so I don't want to burn myself out by juggling too many things that I can't do. So yeah, it's like just a long way of saying that I'm like typically a one project person, but I like to have, I think my ideal situation is to have like something in play that's like at festivals, but also, and be promoting that kind of thing. That's like a finished piece that's out in the world, but also like making moves for the next thing.
absolutely.
So, just to like not ever stop completely, but have like, that momentum that, is sort of scratching my creative itch, but also not burning me out, if that makes sense.
I think that's a pretty good note to end on, I guess. Do you have any other broad thoughts on strategy, career wise, process wise, anything like that?
I mean, I think um, learning graphic design is like a very hidden, sort of elusive thing that doesn't get discussed enough among independent filmmakers, because we are our own, publicists and self-promoters now. I think either getting good / better at graphic design or having a go-to graphic designer is like, I think, definitely more of a secret weapon than people sort of give um, credit to.
Yeah.
So like you design your own stuff
Yeah.
often, right? If
Yeah.
not,
Yeah. Because I'm too cheap to have someone else do it. I just have to like force myself. So that's how I learned. I learned how to use InDesign just for making a lookbook for my film. But
right.
that's the main thing that people. I mean, I made the poster and everything else too. I mean, it's you got to
Yeah.
grab people's attention. I'd say the same thing is true with also editing. I think a lot of us already do editing by nature already, but yeah, you're definitely right as far as like just working through the aesthetics and as a promotional thing, but also like it all benefits everything else too. I think it
Right.
your filmmaking language, just knowing graphic design and how to articulate this stuff.
Right. Yeah. So if you don't have the time or bandwidth or resources to be the graphic designer yourself, I think, thinking long and hard about how you would be the creative director to your graphic designer to properly like realize that part of your film once it's like made, um, is yeah, is definitely a valuable skill that I think often gets overlooked. People get so focused on finishing the film that, they haven't thought much about how they're really going to put it out there when, the festival acceptances come in and they want all this stuff from you. Like, if you haven't made a press kit before, that's like incredibly intimidating.
Oh yeah, yeah. And it's just like how you balance, like, not just like the graphic stuff, but also like, and we can go into that too, as far as like, doing stuff like log lines, synopses, like all
Right.
those character, breakdowns, and I think knowing your audience is, is kind of pivotal with all of this, and like, but yeah, you have to be strategic about who it's going out to and at what phase, right? So like,
Totally. And so, yeah, I mean, I would say that that's a good sort of through line back to talking about staying engaged with my feature, which is taking so long, is like basically hammering out a lot of the aesthetics through making that lookbook, and being so immersed in that. I mean, it's almost like this way of like defining how the movie is going to look if and when, it does get made. It's almost like this proof of concept for that, as much as it is a marketing material to like entice investors and talent and that kind of thing.
absolutely. I like one thing that I say to a couple buddies of mine is like it's all part of the process. Like you just have to like just go with it as it comes and trust the process to, reveal itself as it goes along. And there will be solutions and there will be pitfalls, but you have to expect them and you have to navigate around them strategically.
Yeah, no, I mean, you have to be fluid. Like, we're not Stanley Kubrick. We can't, terrorize people into doing the thing we want them to do.
Yeah,
So,
that's not a very good set to be on, but
no.
anyway. All right. Well, thank you very much, Jim. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, man.
Yes,
Thanks for having me.
thank you. Look out for our next conversation with Brett Radner coming up.
Oh no.
One we put on the books already.
So, Brett, who's your favorite X-Man? It's like,
Yes, all the quality Brett Radner content coming up.
yeah. What's your favorite karate move?
All right. Well, thank you again.
Yep.
Talk to you.
Thank you.